are his most holy, wise, and powerful, preserving and governing all his creatures and all their actions. We got a chance to skim the surface when we talked about the decree in question 7, but this will get more specific in all of those areas. Providence is all about God causing all things to come to pass, his governing of all things, his care for his creatures, and especially for his own people. So I say causing all things, but of course that's the decree. So here we're just getting more specific into his ongoing work. We touched on 2 verses that are usually brought in, Genesis 50:20 about Joseph, which I will come back to, and Romans 8:28, 2 famous texts that are examples of providence. But this is a different work of God than his work of creation. It's distinct. Even though they're both what we would call part of the decree, they're distinct. Thomas Watson looks at the words of Jesus in John 5:17, where he says, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." And you say, well, wait, what about Genesis 2, where he said that he ceased from all his work? So what does Jesus mean? Well, Watson looks at that and says, God has rested from the works of creation. He does not create any new species of things. He rested from all his works. And so he mentions Genesis 2:2, and therefore this is a Puritan way of speaking, it must needs be meant, in other words, he means, of his works of providence. So see, Watson is distinguishing between the work of creation and the work of providence and saying, that's what Jesus means. That's why Jesus' words make perfect sense, because he's distinguishing between creation and providence. At the very least, of course, Jesus can mean special providence. Jesus can mean, of course, he's in the middle of healing somebody there. That's the context of that. So he means more than that. Watson's only point is to just clear away the idea that somehow doesn't make sense. No, it makes perfect sense. Okay, so we'll divide this in this doctrine into 4 heads. I always like it when it works out, the alliteration thing. But anyway, I suppose I could have called it something else. But defining providence, dissecting providence, meaning we're just going to get into the scalpel, with the scalpel, and just see what we're distinguishing. We're going to distinguish providence from things like miracles, things like the decree itself, and then evil. How does the ordering of providence, how does that relate to evil? And then defending providence, if we have time, defending providence. As always, I have more notes than I know what to do with, so we'll get to it. The word providence comes from 2 Latin words, which at first when you put them together, you might think, well, I think I know what providence is, and it doesn't seem like that's a full enough idea. And those 2 words are vidare, which is where we get the word video, actually. So you can see right away what that would mean. Seeing, to see. And then the word pro. So beforehand, seeing before. Foresight, wait a minute. Providence means more than that, right? So it doesn't seem like a full enough description. But it is, and if it helps, think of the idea of, I'll describe this picture in a second. Think about the expression, see to it. Like, see to it that you do your homework. See to it that you clean your room. See to it that you take out the garbage, and so on and so forth. What do I mean when I say see to it in that sense? I mean more than simply seeing ahead of time, but I actually mean ordering. Take care of these things, and so forth. So that's the idea. The actor is not merely seeing a series of events with the mind, but is carrying out in an orderly manner. And so the sight becomes an eye to affecting. Of course, you might also think of the English word provide. That comes from the same word. Provision is not simply seeing, it's caring for, it's supplying. And we may rightly have in mind God's regular care of, say, the animals and plant life. So the first verse I have there, Psalm 104, 27 and 28. These, speaking about the lower creatures, these all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. Now, obviously, this is figurative language because God does not have a hand. But on the other hand, he doesn't want us to say, oh, so he really doesn't mean that no, he wants us to have the sense as if someone were opening their hand to feed the animals. What you have in mind that God does that. Not with a literal hand, but nevertheless, he cares regularly for the creatures. This is a picture of a personal provision of a caring God who sees to it that his creatures have what they need. Now, there's a special providence for his own children. And here I don't just mean now we're moving from animals to humans. I also mean to his elect, which we'll talk about. But we do have an early picture of that in the Bible. Think of Mount Moriah in Genesis 22, where you have the story of Abraham and Isaac. And how does God reveal himself to Abraham on Mount Moriah? And this is still part of defining, because you'll notice that in the Hebrew there's a name that we take for God. And of course we Englishize it in Jehovah Jireh. And of course there's the actual Hebrew word there. But if you look at the Hebrew, yireh comes from the Hebrew root, the verb ra'ah, which means to see. So in other words, the same thing that is happening in the Latin was already happening in the Hebrew. And in your study Bible, or I guess in any Bible, you'll see a footnote there, that verse in 22, verse 8, where it will say, because the Lord will provide. There'll be a footnote, and in your margin in your Bible, it'll say, or the Lord who sees. And you're like, oh, there it is again. So there's this close connection between seeing and providing for. Because the question there was, Isaac had asked, I see the wood, I see the fire, but where's the lamb? And so Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And here you don't just have special provision for God's children, you have a type and a shadow of the ultimate lamb, which we'll talk about in the sermon. So that goes very nicely with what Jesus is for us. And so closely associated was God himself with this act of provision that Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. Okay, so notice the two action words in the catechism answer itself. And I have here on this preserving over here, and I have that covering everything, meaning nature. And I'm just using that word to mean the cosmos, the universe. You name it, it's in there if it's part of creation. But I also have the blue timeline, the left to right, representing history. Now, I also have a cross-section of that guy, any guy, doesn't matter, because it goes on to say all his creatures and all their actions. What do you mean? Do you mean this? Do you really mean this? It says all. So I want to cover, as symbolically as I can, everything. But this governing is referring to the time. Now, there's overlap. You can speak of him governing the water cycle, not simply preserving. But we're just using that shorthand as these two pillars of creation, namely the impersonal and the personal. Nature, where he's preserving and he's ordering, but these are the two words that the Catechism answer uses, preserving and governing. You can think of preserving like he's upholding, he's sustaining. That's another word we'd use. Sustaining these things, keeping them in existence, but also not just that, driving them, or governing would be directing. Think of the pieces, think of chess or something like that. But here he's providentially ordering all of the affairs of men, all the affairs of history. So for example, Galatians 4:4, where he talks about Jesus coming in the fullness of time. What all is packed into the fullness of time? Things like Daniel prophesied, Alexander's empire coming together, splitting into four, and all the things that come out of that, Greek going out to the world, one roadway system that the Romans built, all these things to prepare the Apostle Paul to go around Europe and spread the gospel and so forth. All of that and more goes into him governing all of the affairs of history, the personal and the impersonal. As far as him preserving, we can think of two verses, Hebrews 1:3, which the Catechism answer uses. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. So that's a providence verse, in addition to whatever else it is. It's a providence verse. And then Colossians 1:17, in him all things hold together. There it is again. He's sustaining, he is upholding things in existence. But it also adds this idea of governing, of God over all of history. So Psalm 103, I use the example of Alexander's empire, things coming to Christ and so on, and that's true. But what we need to see is that this actually covers everything. So we can't move, okay, that's amazing. I see that about the gospel, but surely not, like Hitler coming to power or whatever else, or something insignificant. No, Psalm 103:19, the Lord has established his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom rules over all. So you think of that passage in the Proverbs that he lifts up kings and puts them down. All of them. The confession puts it in this way. I have a couple of statements from the confession because this is such a deep concept and the words of the confession are so helpful and precise that I think they're worth reading. The very first part of chapter 5 of the Westminster Confession says, God, the great creator of all things, doth uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures, actions, and things from the greatest even to the least, by his most wise and holy providence, according to his infallible foreknowledge and the free and immutable counsel of his own will, to the praise of the glory of his wisdom, power, justice, goodness, and mercy. You can see there, it's an elaboration of what's said in the Catechism answer. There's just more words. To zoom in the lens. I love words like dispose. So, for example, when he's done with the Assyrian king, he's done with the Assyrian king. And that's the way he talks about it. I'm done with you. Like in chapter 10 of Isaiah, it's in here. Oh, yeah, it's in my notes here. He doesn't just raise him up and then just kind of lets him run according to his own power. He's just this idea that he just flicks him off the chessboard when he's done using him, right? So it covers everything. There's a totality to this providence, just as there was with the creation. It covers, here's the words, all his creatures and all their actions. And that's why, when I come back to this, that's why I have that cross-section there, where I have, for this person, any person, thoughts, feelings. My eyesight's so bad. I'm sure I have affections or feelings, decisions, events, so events around them. Think about Proverbs 16:9 and Ephesians 2:10, just to pick two words where you have the idea of walking or steps, where the heart of man plans his ways, but the Lord directs his steps. Or Ephesians 2:10, that we are his workmanship created in Christ Jesus for good works, which he created beforehand that we should walk in them. So you have this idea of this sort of, where he's laying the track before us. Even as he's fueling us and making the engine go, he's also laying the tracks before us. Like everything, even the events that we're about to step into, that will become the occasion of us exercising virtue, hopefully, are ordained by him as well. So down to the most minute, down to the most seemingly random. So Proverbs 16:33, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. So in other words, the proverb here is picking something random. It's not random. We think it's random. That's why he's going there. He wants us to know that's not random either. Mention Genesis 50:20, and I said I'd get back to this. And it's relevant, of course, because you have the divine decree, but you also have evil. But you don't just have the decree and evil. It's not like God sets it up impersonally and just sort of goes away. It'll happen. The idea there is God is present. God is directing. So not only was God the one behind the immediate actions of Joseph's brothers, we talked about that. God was also the main sender of Joseph, but not only that, God is the one who caused the famine that drove them there. Psalm 105:16 and 17 says, when he summoned a famine on the land and broke all supply of bread, he had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. It's not simply that he sent Joseph, but he sent the famine. And conversely, it's not simply that he sent the famine, but it says that he sent a man ahead of them. You say, well, no, the brothers sent the man ahead of him. God may have allowed that, permitted that, and certainly we can speak about the permissive will as to the mechanism of it, but the psalm says here that God was the ultimate sender. And so Genesis 50:20 only makes sense if God caused even the brothers' evil plot, that he orchestrated it. When he says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. God's the ultimate meaner there, just like he's the ultimate sender. And we talked a little bit about, well, how does that, we'll come back to it, so I'll just wait for that, the fourth section. The minute level that providence covers is not simply to, certainly not just to win an argument, but it's not even merely to create awe, but also comfort. Calvin treats the doctrine of providence, he writes a lot about it, in terms of its comfort to us. But here's one verse as to why. Matthew 10, 29 and 31, the Catechism answer also brings this in, and this is Jesus saying, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore. You are of more value than many sparrows." So according to Jesus, the reaction that we are to have to this idea that God is really involved at that level is, therefore, fear not. So that's the punchline, the takeaway from the doctrine. In this second section, what I mean by dissecting, let's start with the words that are used. In other words, as we get in there with the magnifying glass or the lens, what do we mean? What sort of a thing, what attributes does this providence have? And the ones mentioned here, you saw more than that in the confession section, but here it focuses on that it is holy, wise, and powerful. The fact that all of God's preserving and governing actions are holy rules out any suspicion that we could cast upon them. And he's telling us this because, of course, we're going to struggle with that. God's enemies will malign him for that. And so in Psalm 145, 17, it says, "The Lord is righteous in all his ways and kind in all his works." So when it's reasoned that if God ordains all their actions, back to Joseph's brothers, or whichever example, if God ordains all their actions, then it follows that he commits their sin, that his fingerprints are on their sin. Or maybe he creates it, or at least he condones it. That's the suspicion. But all of these are false. To speak of his causality, his ordaining it, is to speak of the permissive causality of God and not the efficient causality of God. You know, there's two extremes we can go with that. I know we covered this at a Q&A time, but let me bring this subject into the main time here. The expression that God is not the author of evil. Here the Bible is saying in all these different ways that he is the one that ordains all these things, including the evil things. So how can God in any sense cause it without creating, committing, or condoning it? Those three C words. And the answer is wrapped up in this idea of permissive causality and not efficient causality. Think of, we talked about this with predestination and double predestination. I know we haven't got there yet, but just think of it in terms of Romans 9, that he uses the same lump of clay. This is a lump of clay that's falling from him. When God regenerates people, let me back it up. When God elects and reprobates, it's not like the lump of clay is neutral and passive and just sitting there and maybe even seeking for God or anything like that. No. The lump of clay is falling toward hell as fast as it can. And he takes from that same lump of clay. So you have election, and then you have reprobation. But reprobation there, just like the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, is passive in the sense that God does not need to create any new principle of evil in Pharaoh's heart or in all of the reprobate for them to fall of their own nature. It already isn't. Now, he does need to create a new principle in the elect. He needs to give them a new heart. So there's not what we call equal ultimacy, but there is double predestination. And likewise, if we can understand that, so it is in all cases of man committing evil. He does not have to create any new principle. Now you say, that's a great explanation for everything after the fall. That doesn't help me with the origin of evil. And we did talk about that in that Q&A time, and I used the light switch example because I think it's the best way to explain the difference between efficient causality and permissive causality. And hit me up again afterwards, and I'll try to explain that again and relate it to some of these verses. But you'll see it throughout the rest of the time. This is not, so Acts 14:16 speaks in this way, this permissive. Permissive doesn't mean it's out of his control or it's the best he can do. No, he meant to do it. Acts 14:16, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways. So here's an initial question to that as far as God's purpose in that. And does he even have a purpose? The answer is yes. Do we honestly believe that a being of all power and all knowledge, who needs nothing in the creature, would have created any such state of affairs that contain evil, unless he knew perfectly well that he could and that he would bring about only that which is good and holy? So one of the first concepts we need to get in our mind is not one that's hard on the mind, but hard on the heart, which is that if there's a circle and that represents an evil action, forget about that circle for a second, would God design that to happen unless he was fully determined and fully capable of bringing about good, sufficient good, his own glory? And the example of Joseph perfectly demonstrates that. He didn't just save a family. He saved a family line that was the Christ. And so he brought Jesus into the world, okay, which saves sinners. So I think you can agree, in that very famous case, you had this work out, to say the least, right? So that's exactly what's happening here. And it's that orchestration, or that conducting that good end from the whole symphony of what looked like a bunch of broken instruments and some downright rebellious instruments, that we mean by wisdom. So, for example, Psalm 104:24. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom have you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Again, think nature and history. Wisdom. Wisdom in nature, the different cycles, the different ways that the animals relate to each other. But also history. All of those evil events coming together as if they're going to stop God's plan, and God always foils his enemies. That is wisdom. When considering both the wisdom of God's providence and its intrinsic goodness, the goodness of his plan over it and his plan in it, it's important to note that simply because his ways are holy and wise doesn't mean that you and I will know how they're holy and wise, that we'll understand everything. So we're talking about his wisdom here. We're not talking about our wisdom. We're not talking about our ability to understand it. But knowing that it is by his providence is absolutely certain. Interpreting that providence is often a fool's errand. And so believing the doctrine of providence is not about, well, I don't understand this today, but I'll understand it tomorrow. Well, you may not understand it tomorrow either. And he may only give us a glimpse in eternity, but what he does show us will be fully satisfying. When it comes to the power of providence, we have to return to the subject of dual agency. You'll remember the language of primary causation and secondary causation. Now I'll explain the picture. The picture last week was going to be of Adam and Eve, and Adam fully clothed, don't worry. But here, you got a shovel. I figured don't reinvent the wheel. Shovel represented his dominion. He was put in the garden to work it and to keep it. So I just have a simple, a tomato plant? Okay, so all I have here is various things in human action and then even the impersonal world, and that God is ordaining all these things and ordering all these things and governing all these things. Okay, so in the grand scheme of things, God alone has primary causation. Those arrows coming down here are primary causation. Everything in the circle is secondary causation. Now, you can speak relatively about efficient causes in this world. The pool player example, or Adam with the shovel. What's the cause of the garden? Well, the efficient cause is Adam. He's the gardener. So on that level. But in the grand scheme of things, when you compare the creator to the creation, there's only one primary cause, and that's God. And everything else is secondary cause. However foundational a cause is to other effects, like Adam. And he was very causal to other events, not just a garden, but all people falling into sin. He was very instrumental. He was very causal over it. But even there, He is a secondary cause. Think of Romans 8:20. I didn't have this in my notes. I don't know why, but Romans 8:20. The creation itself was subject to futility, not willingly, not by its own will. Paul's not denying that Adam willfully did that. That's not his point. He's raising us up to a bigger point. Not by its own will, but by the will of him who subjected it in hope. Now, who's that? Is that the devil? The devil didn't have any hope in the fall. Was it Adam? Adam just sinned. Adam didn't have the gospel in mind when he sinned. Speaking of God, that God was the ultimate one who subjected the creation to futility. It was his plan. It was his will. Through the agency of Adam's willfulness. Paul wasn't saying Adam did not willfully sin. Didn't say that. It's just not what he's focusing on there. You have other verses that talk about Adam's sin, right? Romans 5:12 and other places. But again, the confession speaks to this as well. In the very next section, so it's still chapter 5, it's section 2 on providence. It says, although in relation to the foreknowledge and decree of God, the first cause, all things come to pass immutably and infallibly, yet by the same providence he ordereth them to fall out, according to the nature of second causes, either necessarily, freely, or contingently. Okay, so he's just sort of laying out, the ways that God orders. This will be important when I read from Thomas Watson in a bit on distinguishing between the decree and providence as a subset of the decree. Providence is that ordering within what is ordained. And what is ordained is necessarily going to come to pass, given God's decree. But the ways that these things come about are necessarily, freely, contingently. Some things are contingent on other things. It doesn't mean it's any less certain to God, but it does mean that some things are not as necessary as other things, and so forth. And so we can speak about some things being bigger than other things, some things being more important than other things, some things glorifying God more than other things. That's why we can do that. Where am I? Okay, so considering distinct kinds of causality together with God's wisdom and power, let's go back to that, is the way to understand how providence is reconciled to things like irregularities. Again, we would call these today random events, chance things, which of course is not a thing. And our theology corrects us about this. It is not merely the random nature of things that disturbs our doctrine, but sometimes we look at things and we say not only randomness by itself wouldn't bother us. We could roll a dice and we're okay with that. But it's sort of the waste and the meaninglessness we see is what bothers. Well, Thomas Watson responds to this. And if you've never read Thomas Watson, you should just read something. It doesn't even matter what it is, because it's such a delight to read, because he has this way with words. Every single paragraph is just like, I wish I wrote that. And but anyway, here's what Watson says about these irregularities and us looking into providence and changing our view. He says, the things that seem to us irregular, God makes use of to his own glory. Suppose you were in a smith's shop and should see there several sorts of tools, some crooked, some bowed, others hooked. Would you condemn all these things because they do not look handsome? The smith makes use of them all for doing his work. Thus it is with the providences of God. They seem to us to be very crooked and strange, yet they all carry on God's work. So I think it's a very fitting analogy, these tools that the smith uses, that in themselves and in isolation, treated abstractly, any one of them would be ugly, rusty, harmful. What's the point of that? But in the mind and the skill of the smith, they're all used to create this perfect product. God even uses the lashing out of the cruel and powerful on earth to do his working. So that last verse, in his power, we mentioned this, he used Assyria. In verse 5, that Assyria is called the rod of his anger, or his justice. And so a couple verses down, You might ask, well, is the Assyrian king thinking of that? Is the Assyrian king thinking, yeah, at least I get to fulfill God's purpose? The Assyrian king isn't thinking that. And so verse 7 says, but he, the Assyrian king, does not so intend, and his heart does not so think, but it is in his heart to destroy. So one of those tools in the smith's shop, what are they thinking? Of course, they're not thinking anything, but the people that God uses, they're bloodthirsty. That's what they're thinking. So why does this highlight God's power? And by the way, his wisdom as well. Because he uses even this person that's trying to do evil, that's trying to oppose God's order. And God is using them the whole time for his own glory. Well, let's separate these things out and not just look into them, but separate them out. I won't treat this as a big section. I have a lot in my notes, but it's not as relevant to providence. The only thing that is just this picture. Because there's a lot you can say about miracles. The very definition that we give to miracles has been botched, not only by Rome and the charismatics, but by naturalists. And so apologetics has to do that work, and Reformed theologians have to do that work. And so there's so many bad definitions of miracles and that we have to do all of that work. But let's at least get this. It's not the same thing as providence. There are things that they have in common. You say, well, a miracle is an act of God. Okay, that's true. But providence is an act of God. Okay, miracles are supernatural acts of God. Providence is also supernatural in that it is God who's ultimately directing it. Okay? Miracles are a direct. And so now you start to get you're getting closer, but there has to be more there. And there's a whole chapter in R.C. Sproul's book, The Invisible Hand, where he talks about miracle. Well, there's actually two, because then there's another chapter that corrects the charismatics and corrects Rome about their different. Because at least Rome understands, and I think charismatics do too, but they try to have it both ways. Rome understands that a miracle, in addition to other things that it is, the thing that they focus on is that it is validating the authority of the messenger. And so if Rome can continue to assert miracles from their saints and so forth, then they believe that that is what shows that they are the true church and so forth. So that has to be dealt with. But it turns out that's not all of what a miracle is anyway. And so centrally it has this idea, and by the way, the word in both the Hebrew and the Greek is a synonym for sign. Well, sign of what? It sort of begs the question as to what is being signified in that. Okay? You can do a whole thing on that, and that's not what this catechism answer is about, but it's worth distinguishing. Let's get even further into this. Skipping all the stuff about miracles, which I think is interesting. But this section in the confession says this. This is the very next section. It's the third in chapter 5. It says, God in his ordinary providence maketh use of means, yet is free to work without, so he can really work directly. He's free to do that. Above and against them at his pleasure. So God ordinarily uses means, and that just refers to all of those secondary causes. Watson makes a helpful general distinction here, and I hinted at it, but now I'll get to it. He says, I call providence God's ordering things to distinguish it from his decree. Say, well, what's the difference? So Watson says this, God's decree ordains things that shall fall out. God's providence orders them. So I have in this picture, the decree ordains, it makes it certain, it affects all that will come about. So Ephesians 1:11, Romans 11:36, and so forth. God causes all that will come about. Providence is the ordering, and there's other kinds of orders. There's an order of salvation. So we can talk about orders within the decree. But providence is this ordering within the decree that's actually God acting on all things in creation, presently, and in a way that tends toward his glory. What the circles represent, and I use the example of Joseph, but you could also use the example of Jesus and the cross and all of the events that happened there. which I'll make reference to. But just going back to Joseph, since I already mentioned it, this smallest thing can also be, by smallest, I might mean the most insignificant to our eyes, or the things that are most evil, and you say, well, God wouldn't have a hand on that directly and whatever. Or it could be a timeline. But ultimately, the bigger circle, as farther you get out, you get toward the end. And by end there, I mean design or motive or what God is aiming at. So the ultimate circle, if I kept going, would be God's glory. One of the bigger circles within that would be the cross of Christ and really the whole work of Christ, because remember, God's saving a family. So Joseph is sold into slavery. Well, first you can even back up further. Joseph revealing his dreams to them, which made them envious to begin with. You can back up even more. Jacob treating him as a favorite. And you could back up even further. But then he's sold into slavery to go down to Egypt. Back to that psalm. There's a famine in the land to bring the family to Egypt. And again, you can keep going out that way. To save the family, bigger circle. To perpetuate the seed, bigger circle. To bring about the Messiah, and you get the idea. Bigger circle, to bring salvation to the world, and so on. Okay, so how does this help us? Well, it helps us be able to see that in this ordering, there's not just logic and wisdom and so forth, and that explains history. You start to see that all things are good in that God is bringing them about and directing them to their end. So you're saying an evil, Augustine talked about this a lot. And it's not familiar language to us today. But all things insofar as they are good. The devil? Hell? Yes, because hell is the manifestation of God's justice, which in itself is good. So, what does this do to our ability or desire to complain about the way things are? It would rebuke us. It would say that we cannot conceive of a better world than the world that God is bringing about. Okay, and there's technical ways to mean that in different ways, but point being that he's ordered everything in a good way. That even bad things, which we must call bad, we must oppose them in that they are bad. They're evil. But God's use of them, God's ordering of them, is wholly good. Because he is bringing about his glory, which is not only good, but is the best. So, for example, we can use the cross of Christ. The crucifixion of Christ was called a glory to the Son in John 12:23, that the Son was going to be glorified. His hour of glory had come. And that is to, bigger circle, the glory of God the Father, Philippians 2:11. And it was precisely that glory drawn to the Son that he draws people to himself, John 12:32. So the maximization of glory to God must always be the greatest happiness to the creature. Because the souls of the creatures are made to run on God's glory. They're designed to flourish, to be what they were made to be on God's glory. So we can distinguish the good ordering of God. We can distinguish that from the evil occurrences stemming from the creature's agency. That's what we mean by distinguishing here. We're doing this partly so that we can distinguish between the good ordering of this thing which contains evil. Say, well, I have a solution to that. We'll just take the evil thing out of it and we'll just sort of extract it from God's doing and we'll put it over here in a second story. No. Not only do you not want to do that, but you can't do that. Isaiah 45:7, God says, I create light and darkness, well-being and calamity. I, the Lord, do all these things. So, though he does not create evil and does not commit evil and does not condone evil, he nevertheless does ordain evil always toward the best end. What's at stake here? Why does this matter? Well, here's one reason. On a worldview level, R.C. Sproul says, Christianity is not a religion of dualism. by which God and Satan are equal and opposite opposing forces. Now, they are opposing forces. The devil opposes God. They're not equal and opposite. Destined to fight an eternal struggle that must result in a tie. God is sovereign over his entire creation, including the subordinate domain of Satan. God is Lord of death as well as life. He rules over pain and disease as sovereignly as he rules over prosperity. Now, why does he say that way at the beginning? It's because if you don't believe this, then in fact you do believe in dualism. That your worldview is ultimately yin and yang. That evil is an equal substance to good, which is to say that Satan or something behind him is just as ultimate as God. And that is heresy and blasphemy and everything else you could possibly think of that's wrong. So, providence helps us, the right doctrine of providence helps us not be dualists. Sorry, my eyes, I have no idea what time it is. I'll leave these on. I think we're good. I'll do a quick version of defending providence. This is not fatalism or occasionalism. So in other words, here's the objections. Your doctrine of providence, your Reformed doctrine, even your classical Augustinian doctrine, which would have been held by all the medieval scholastics as well, the good ones, Thomas Aquinas, Peter Lombard, whoever else, Anselm, they would have all agreed with Augustine and the Reformers on this, that there is a strong providence, use the language of those people, the only kind of providence there is, that God is literally directing all of the affairs of history and so forth. Well, people hear that and they say, well, that's fatalism or that's occasionalism. Fatalism because they're using it as a synonym for determinism. They're actually somewhat different. But obviously, in the central point, what they have in mind is, therefore, our actions don't matter. And so, well, here's just two differences right away between the Augustinian Calvinist doctrine of providence and fatalism. First of all, fatalism, as a pagan idea, was both finite and impersonal. So in other words, the fates, you can dress them up any way you want to, the forces of nature or virtues or whatever else, into these personal beings. You'll notice that those personal beings, those gods, are entirely wrapped up in the creation. They are creatures. They are practically passions. They're, as Schaeffer said, they're amplified humanity. They are not deity in any sense. And so fatalism is the ultimate cause of all these things are both finite and impersonal. So you look at the stars to consult and so forth. It's whereas the infinite personal God causing everything, well, that makes all the difference in the world. And we talk about ways in which that is, but it's not the same thing, just on the surface. Occasionalism was this doctrine that there is only one cause to all things, namely God. And they don't mean primary, and then you have secondary causation. They mean there's actually no such thing as secondary causation. That what we call the surface and human action and so forth is actually simply the occasion, think of it that way, or the local expression of this singular cause. Okay, well, that's obviously not the doctrine, because this doctrine teaches that there is primary causation and that those secondary causes are very real and meaningful. Well, I had to read this book a couple years ago by a guy named David Ferguson, not to be confused with Sinclair Ferguson, because Sinclair Ferguson would make this mistake. But David Ferguson is a professor of theology at the University of Edinburgh, and he wrote a book called The Providence of God, in which he criticizes the Reformed and really the whole classical Christian view. And he levels these accusations against it, which are all wrong. It's too philosophical, meaning it's too orderly. That's what they mean. Sometimes they mean too many extra biblical words, but of course they use extra biblical words to say it. So there goes that one. 2, unattractive to modern sensibilities. Yeah, I'll bet. We watch too much TV. There goes that one. 3, come on, how is that even intimidating? Modern people won't go in for this. Okay, and that's number 3. It subsumes, oh wow, look at that. Providence, sorry, I meant to say providence, under the decree of predestination. That gets heady it's wrong, but it's more of a Barthian objection. Don't worry about that. But people see Calvinism. Oh, you're all about predestination. That's what came first. In fact, predestination is actually your God, and it's a caricature. It's not true of the original view. It reduces providence to the Father ignoring his two hands. That's an expression that comes from Eastern theology, the Greek Orthodox. What they're saying is the Son and the Spirit are means in which God also orders things. That gets heady too. It's a legitimate concern because that's good theology to show how the whole Trinity is providentially involved, but it's not true that the classical view is guilty of that. It lacks a corrective to the status quo. In other words, if you believe in providence, then you don't believe in changing things, which means you don't believe in having outrage against evil. So slavery exists, Nazi Germany exists, etc. Pick an evil. You can't critique that. In fact, you're just going to, it's basically a Marxist critique. You're just going to pat the poor person on the head and say, now, you better just enjoy your lot in life. That's sort of the objection there. But again, that ignores primary and secondary causation. Same problem with the 6th and the 7th, is at the end of the day, a lot of these are just ignoring or not understanding that dual agency, primary and secondary causation, which are central to this doctrine. I know that's heady, that last part, so I'll leave it at that. Let me open it up to questions.
So just going back to, sin, human sin, and you mentioned that God doesn't cause us to sin.
Yeah.
He kind of leaves us to our natural inclination.
Right.
And that's fine to take that from the fall.
Yeah.
What about before the fall? But
Yeah.
even before that,
Lucifer.
what about Satan?
Yeah. There's biblical pictures. Now, this is debatable. Edwards would have held to this view, I know, and I'm just picking him just because I remember that, and there's others that did. Others will push back against this, but at any rate, there was a traditional view that Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 that speak about the King of Tyre, that it's used typologically. Now, usually types point forward to Christ. In this case, it's a type back to the fall of the devil. It mentions this historical king, but it also does it in a way where he mentions him as a cherub. He mentions him as, you were in Eden. You were a worshiping cherub. And then he fell because of pride and so forth, and he talks about his punishment and so on. That's one thing to factor in, but that doesn't answer your question. But that is a biblical thing to look at, that let's start with that Satan was not created Satan. Again, this goes back to dualism. So one thing we have to say that's clear is that the first evil being could not have been created evil. That would, if we say that he was, you've got two choices, and they're both bad. One is to say that it's dualism, equal and opposite, that he's an ultimate being like God. That won't work. The other option is to say that God made him bad, that God makes bad things. And that won't work either. Okay? So, what's the alternative? And no one expressed the alternative better than Augustine. Now, this was picked up by the likes of William Perkins and Jonathan Edwards. There is language in the Westminster Confession that hints at this, which remind me, and I'll come back to it. Where would I come back to it? I'm not sure. So I'll just maybe tack it on to the end of one of the other ones coming up, and I'll quote it. But the idea is this, and it's hard when you don't have it on the screen to remember. I have a 10-point summary of Augustine's view, which I use as a canned answer. You would imagine this comes up a bit with Ed Ligonier, and it does. And so I use this 10-point. Now, is that 10 points anywhere in Augustine's book? I'm referring to his book called The Free Choice of the Will. It was written in 397, and he was making an argument against the Manichaeans, people he came from, that light and darkness are these equal substances. He's saying, no, it's not, and here's why. And he goes back to the distinction between being and privation, and other distinctions that come from, that you'll recognize if you have some background reading Plato. But Augustine's not just sort of taking Plato and putting Christian stamps on it. He's correcting Plato where he needs to be corrected and so forth. But what he's saying, and much like when you flip the light switch on and you flip the light switch off, in both states of affairs that result, light coming on, light going off, in both you are equally causing the state of affairs, light versus darkness. You as the agent, as the light flipper, are causing both. However, you're causing them both in two different ways. One you're doing efficiently. Light is emanating, and that has substance. When you flip down, light is diffusing. So are you creating darkness? Does darkness have a substance? No. And that's essentially what Augustine's saying. He's saying that God is both willing and able to create beings, and he only creates good things. But God is equally able to turn the lights off, to withdraw his operative grace, not to create any evil principle, but to withdraw his grace and to let those beings go to their own nature. Now, God creates ex nihilo. He creates out of nothing, right? So what's the ultimate substance of created beings? If you're a created being, do you have the power of being to exist on your own? No. And so if God lets you go, there's a scripture for this, Job 34:15, if he should set his heart to it and withdraw his spirit from all flesh, then everything would return to dust. It's a poetic Hebrew way of saying to nothingness. And so God is able to withdraw his grace, maybe not completely. Now think of a light dimmer versus turning the off switch. Can God sustain beings in hell? Yes, without annihilating them. He can, and he will sustain them forever in that state. Can God sustain Lucifer and Adam dimming the lights? Can he withdraw some of his grace, but not all of it till they don't exist at all? He can. And so I think Augustine's answer to that question is not meant to solve every mystery. It's not meant to give us an instant replay. Okay, so what did it look like in Adam in that first evil disposition? It's not the point. There's obviously an infinity of mystery there. But it is at least a coherent answer, and one which, if you try to come up with another answer, you'll have a big problem on your hands of one kind or another. Yeah. Any other questions at all? All right, let me pray. Father, we thank you for this time. Lord, cause this doctrine of your providence, your control of all things, and bringing all things to a perfect good, to your glory, for the good of your children. Cause this to be a comfort to us and a wonder to us, that we would give you glory in seeing all things from your hand. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.